hello. I'm James, and I'll be your host for this season of the Everyday Forum podcast, an original Stratfest at Home podcast showcasing a sampling of the thought-provoking discussions from the Stratford Festival's 2025 Meighen Forum, the festival within the festival designed to enhance and contextualize the performances in the main Stratford Festival season. The following discussion was recorded in front of a live audience in Lazaretus Hall at the Tom Patterson Theatre in Stratford, Ontario, Canada. Enjoy! Bonjour and good morning, everyone. My name is James Hyatt. I'm the Associate Coordinator of the Forum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our panel this morning titled, Who Are We? Canadian Culture on the Global Stage. Now, this is our third and final panel on our Global Theatre Week sort of programming series. And as I've said in the previous two panels, some of the impetus behind doing this themed week is about putting us as Canadians and people that are here in Canada into context of global culture, global theatre practices, and how we fit in there, because it can sometimes feel fairly distant. But as some of you know, we come up with these ideas for panels around this time in the year. So this time last year, we were thinking about sort of what this season would be like, and thinking about the plays on this season with Anne of Green Gables, with Forgiveness, The Art of War. There are so many different types of Canadian stories and stories about Canada being told in different ways on different stages, different types of people and different people. So we wanted to have a panel that specifically examined like how these different ways of telling stories about Canada can coexist and what they say about Canadian cultural identity. There's a lot to say about this, as I'm sure you'll all appreciate. And so I wanted to begin by quoting from two songs from a band from my hometown of Kingston, Ontario, but probably not the band that you're thinking of. Firstly, Canada's really big. And secondly, we've got rocks and trees and trees and rocks and rocks and trees and trees and rocks and rocks and trees and trees and rocks and water. That's the Arrogant Worms, for anyone that doesn't know. They're a comedy band, but it's true. We do have a lot of land and nature. This is an important starting place for our country, obviously. Countries being sort of human creations, but the land comes first. So in that spirit, I'd like to begin by thanking and acknowledging the land for literally holding us up, providing us food and shelter and rocks. The water that feeds the land, the lake is unfortunately a bit low at the moment, but still beautiful and helps feed us. The animals, the fish, birds, and bugs that care for and inhabit the land, the trees and plants that again give us food, the sun and the sky above us, and of course acknowledge the Indigenous nations that have cared for the land for generations. That's the nations of the Neutral Confederacy and the Mississaugas and other Anishinaabe nations. I'm very glad that you're all here today. This is a very exciting panel. So, who are these people who are going to talk to you? Let me introduce them to you. Immediately to my right is Peter Hodgins. Peter is Associate Professor in the Carleton School of Canadian Studies. His research interests include the politics and poetics of public memory in Canada, Canadian cultural nationalism, and Canadian cultural studies. Welcome, Peter. Next to Peter is Hiro Kanagawa, a Vancouver-based writer and actor. His play Indian Arm received a Governor-General's Literary Award for Drama. His other plays include The Tiger of Malaya and The Patron Saint of Stanley Park, both of which have been performed across Canada, as well as Forgiveness, which you may have seen in that theatre over there. Welcome, Hiro. Next to Hiro is Anne Nothof. Anne is Professor Emerita at Athabasca University, where she developed and tutored courses in literature and drama. She has edited collections of essays on Sharon Pollock, Alberta theatre, and a collection of Alberta plays. She's the past president of the Canadian Association of Theatre Research and is editor of the Canadian Theatre Encyclopedia, which you can find online at canadiantheatre.com. Welcome, Anne. And last but not least, our moderator for today, Keith Barker, a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario and the director of The Art of War this season, as well as the director of Forster Burstein New Play Development Program at the festival. Keith played Louis Riel in The Women of the Fur Trade 2 seasons ago, is that right? Yeah. Along with many other roles across Canada. He's also a playwright and has won the Dora Award for Best New Play for This Is How We Got Here. And we're very grateful for him to be here today. Welcome, Keith.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces and also some new faces out here. So we're going to start. We had some of you know, maybe some of you don't. We usually have a bit of a Zoom before we get up onto this stage, and we had a long conversation about the things we wanted to talk about, and then we as a group decided. Hiro had a great conversation just about his engagement in Germany with when he was overseas in engaging as an artist. So we thought that'd be a great way to start.
Yeah. So. The idea of who I am as a Canadian, until I was 30, I had spent 1/3 of my life in Japan, 1/3 in Canada, and 1/3 in the U.S. And, compared to Japan and the U.S., which both are very strong, which both of these countries have very strong national identities, which at the time I didn't feel Canada did. So for much of my adult life, I have struggled with what does it mean to be Canadian. But a year and a half ago, I was invited to an academic conference in Germany and had an opportunity to read from my plays there. And this conference, which was in its 49th year, was the Conference of Canadian Studies in the German-speaking states. And so there were academics from all over Europe, not just the German-speaking states, but also France and many other, Spain too probably, and Italy and many other nations in Europe. And it was a huge revelation to me that just as there are European studies departments here or Asian studies departments, that in Europe and presumably other areas of the world, there are Canadian studies departments in the universities, and there are academics who have devoted their careers to studying Canada. So to be at this conference and to be immersed amongst these people who find Canada actually quite fascinating was a revelation to me. And to listen to the papers that they delivered and the conversations around the dinner tables and so on, I did feel tremendous, perhaps for one of the first times in my adult life, I did feel a tremendous pride in being Canadian, and I came to understand that yes, Canada is a distinctly unique culture, which others in the world feel, it's worthy of study and of celebration. It occurred to me that that's something that perhaps we don't do enough of here at home amongst ourselves. That the U.S. is very good at hyping itself up, and Japan, in its own quiet way, has done a great job of exporting Japanese culture and presenting to the world an idea of Japan that they want to promote. And it occurred to me that Canada does not do that enough, given who we are and what we stand for and what we represent on the world stage. So, for the last year and a half, I've very much been thinking about that. And my experience here at Stratford this year has very definitely cemented in me, again, that pride, that kind of renewed pride now that I feel about being Canadian.
That's great. Peter and Ann, I was just wondering, in terms of, Canadian culture on a global stage, do you have a story or an experience that you had? We were just talking in the Spirit Lounge about your experience internationally. If you've had an experience or a story you wanted to share about your experience on an international stage.
I'm happy to jump in. I've actually been to the same conference in Germany, not in the same year. And what I think what I found fascinating by the Germans were, and there's also Austrians and Swiss and many Europeans, what they were fascinated about Canadians were not the fact that we don't have a strong national identity in the same way the Americans do, the Germans used to have before, which became very sort of violent at a certain point in time, is the fact that Canadian identity was an open question, which created a certain openness. Canadian identity is an ongoing conversation. So there isn't a Canadian identity. There is this sort of process by which we grapple towards a Canadian identity, which constantly, and there's no closure on that question. We constantly try to include more people. We include, for example, increasingly, and I think I saw 2 plays by Keith and Hiro in the last couple of days. We try to incorporate these difficult pasts, right? So, and these difficult memories, and try to do justice to those memories, even though that at times sort of weakens the possibility for a strong national identity, right? But in some ways we want to sort of a just and open national identity, and so the kind of closure of who we are becomes a way of we refuse that, and that's what the Europeans are interested in. Because that's what they wanted to talk about. They wanted to talk about multiculturalism. They wanted to talk about the openness of Canadian national identity. And I think that's what we're people looking to right now.
Well, I wish I could report an extraordinary experience of seeing a Canadian play abroad, but most of my travels have been to England and London in particular to see theatre, because I was interested in English theatre and Irish theatre, still am. But and I did locate Canadian plays during my trips, but they were usually in pub theatres, which are great places to go if you haven't checked them out. The one that is most supportive when I was going, and still is the Finborough Theatre in London. I think they get some money. I'm sure they get some money from the Canadian government to assist them with this support, but it's very difficult to find, So on one dark and stormy night, I was hunting down the Finborough Pub Theatre, and I went into the pub and said, "Do you know where the theatre is?" And he said, "I know, I don't." And it was downstairs somewhere in the pub, and he didn't know it. But anyway, I saw, I've seen some very good plays, and they've even contacted me about, possible Canadian plays, and have playwright in residence from time to time. Yeah, and the critical reception to like earlier Canadian plays on their main stages, like productions of Brad Fraser and Heather Thompson. It was, as I say, it was a number of years ago now, but the critics were shocked, like, oh, and there's places where, the West Edmonton Mall is the most famous landmark, and it snows all the time. How come Canada has a theatre, and it was so brutal and very, in terms of Brad Fraser, very violent sexually, and so, there's still not a huge, audience for Canadian plays in England that I've discovered, but like my colleagues on the stage here, there's certainly an appetite for Canadian theatre in Japan and in Germany, and that's a lot because of the translations, of course. And one translator has, in the past, translated 50 Canadian plays into Japanese for a theater called the Maple Leaf Theater in Tokyo. And again, it's a small theater, but it has the loyal following, and that's had a great deal to do with enthusiasm for Canadian plays in Japan. So yeah, a lot of export of Canadian theater depends on translation. We need the translators to go into these other languages, and also festivals, because sometimes Canadian plays are invited because they fit in with the theme of a festival, like an Indigenous Theatre Festival in Australia, for example, where they see commonalities and they're interested in the explorations of these topics and events in history for their festivals. But I'd like to mention, before I get too far along with this talk, that I did see, both of the Canadian plays here on war and asking the question who we are. And I think they were just fantastic. When I went to see, for example, Forgiveness, it just blew me away. I'm sure if you've seen it, you'd have the same experience. Because for me, it just so well enacts interculturality. That is, what's happening in Canada now is speaking from different voices and showing how they talk to each other or not. So I've just written this down last night because I thought I could probably do a very good job with it if I didn't write it down. So Forgiveness enacts differences in culture, beliefs, and religion, bringing them together on the stage to confront and share and understand each other, including the hard realities of history and human behavior and prejudice. So I was really glad to see this play, even though it's not an easy play to see, because of how it, through the historical sequences and time, shows how a family survives or doesn't, So this is an enactment of what's popularly known as interculturalism. We don't use so much the term multiculturalism because that's considered to be too political academically. So I'm just quoting now from playwright and director Mary Vengo, who I admire a great deal. She started many theaters, and especially in the East, the Nightwood Theatre in Toronto. Very, very good playwright and director. She just died recently, but I like to quote this, what she says about interculturalism. Cultural cross-pollination is vital. It's not just about representation. Representation on its own is dead. It's like a museum. If it doesn't lead to cross-pollination on some level, why do it? It's not about seeing things on a shelf. It's about what happens when they're brought together, when they inform one another.
That's great. Thank you. I'm just pulling up a couple of the themes we're talking about internationally, when there's engagement with our culture, with art, with visual, with dance, with theater, there tends to be enthusiasm, but also surprise. And I'm just wondering for you folks, what do you think that says about what we do, who we are, what our artists are either accomplishing or not embracing, maybe? Thoughts?
I think in Japan, which is an ancient country, right? Mm-hmm. Canada is just so very young. And so I think that's part of the reason why Japanese people are often surprised to learn that Canada has cultural institutions, that because, they have kabuki and no drama, which are many hundreds and many, almost, in the case of No, almost a millennia old. So there's that. Just the youth of our country, and the fact that its image abroad, I think, is dominated by the geography, just how vast it is for Europeans and for Japanese who come from very small countries. The vastness of Canada tends to be the image that they have, And I'm sure you all have had this experience of traveling abroad and getting into a taxi or something, and when the taxi driver learns that you're Canadian, they'll kind of spew the few facts they know about Canada. And I think one of the first ones I often get is, "Oh, do you speak French?" Right? And you have similar experiences, I suppose.
Absolutely. I think it's not just the vastness of Canada. I think in Europe, there's still the image that we're all somehow lumberjacks. we all live in these kind of rural areas. We spend our days wrestling beavers and chopping down trees.
Yeah, but lumberjack jackets are back in fashion, by the way. Yeah.
Right, and so when they meet you and they engage with Canadian art and are understood broadly, they're always surprised by the fact that most Canadian artists are deeply deeply locked into global art currents. Right, so my partner is the Dean of Fine Arts at Concordia, and her colleagues are always flying off to doing a residency in Vienna or a residency in Sao Paulo, and there's this global mobility of Canadian art that used to be that is part of the scene now, and part of it is because Canada. One of the things we're talking about is that whenever you go anywhere in the world, every cab driver also has a cousin in Canada. And because of the fact that we are so networked by multiple diasporas, right, that Canadian artists often have this huge mobility. And I think that's often surprising to people because they have this image of us as this rural, one of the jokes, you go to academic conferences and the joke is like, you can tell someone's a Canadian because if a tree fell in the way, they're the one who would clean it up. So that perception of us. But Canada, certainly within the sort of intellectual circuits, the art circuits I know well, is really wired into the global networks. And I think that is something that's surprising to people who are not necessarily really into the art world, that Canadian writers, and if you look at a Canadian writer like Michael Ondaatje, for example, is probably my favorite writer, his books once in a while touch on Canada, but they're set in Italy, they're set in Northern California, they're set in Sri Lanka. He, as an author, he firmly identifies himself as a Canadian author, but that doesn't mean he only writes in Canada. He writes on the world because he's also from the world, like the rest of us.
It's interesting to hear you say something about like how young this country is. Like we can look back 2 or 3 generations, and lots of us our ancestors landed here. And I was recently at Banff for the playwrights. They have a playwrights retreat that happens annually. They bring a bunch of international artists in, and one of those artists was a British artist named Inua Ellams. He's very famous. He knows all the people, and it was quite a big thing that he was there. And when everybody around the room introduced themselves, all the Canadians introduced themselves, what land they were from, who the indigenous peoples of that land were, and then we're also grateful to be here. And 3 of the international artists were all really taken aback by that. Just the idea is like, how do you all know this? How are you all able to just speak? Like even people here, because you see the shows and it's this thing that you hear the land acknowledgement, and you may not remember all of them, but you know some of them. And so it's just that idea that it's just starting to get ingrained in like the younger generation of kids, they just know it. And that because we're a young country, people don't know what was here before. They're just starting to learn and understand that there were people here before Canada was made, before people landed and made those changes. And so international people have long histories of the land that they're from have almost forgotten who the original peoples were of their lands. And we're so young, we actually we're doing the work right now to kind of investigate and talk about, as even recently, like I would say Forgiveness is a uniquely Canadian story told through a Canadian's vision that is an alternative form of history that lots of people don't know about. And that idea of like, hey, the other history also happened and existed, but here's also another story of the same that runs alongside. It's like the 2-row wampum belt that under this territory, there's 2 rivers and they're in 2 canoes and they're both paddling the same direction in separate rivers. And that's the idea of this. I see stories like Forgiveness, and I see us in 2 canoes looking across 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 canoes. We're all in different stories. We all have different experiences based on those things. And yet it's a uniquely Canadian story when we start talking about multicultural, interculturalism, that mix. I'm wondering if for all of you, in terms of that, do we call ourselves Canadians? Is it more fluid than that now? Like how internationally, how do they see us? Like you were in Germany reading your plays and talking, like what were the conversations around you being Canadian? Were they exciting? Were they like, what were the questions being asked of that? Yes.
Oh, well, I've been always fascinated by the fact that Germans really are excited about, well, not Germans, but a lot of Germans are really excited about Indigenous
Yes.
life in Canada. And they even have, clubs and meetings, and they gather together and put on the headdresses and act
Drew Hayden
parts.
Taylor
And-
has a great documentary on CBC.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Where he
yeah,
goes
it's
over
really
and sees
funny.
it.
Yeah, Drew Hayden Taylor is an Indigenous playwright. In fact, he's from the reserve next to Peterborough, where
Kirk
I
Lake.
grew up. Yeah, and he had this very funny film on Indigenous level of indigeneity in Germany. But it wasn't critical. It was very humorous, and people were quite glad to participate and say why they were so interested in Canada in this respect. And of course, there are a lot of German tourists coming to Canada because of that, but also because they're in love with the mountains. Germans love the open spaces and the woods and hiking, and so whenever you see a very well-dressed hiker on the trail with an all-new kit, you know that it's probably a German fellow. Yeah, I was intrigued by that, but of course their spaces are not very big anymore. They have the manicured forests, and they're trying to preserve what they can of the original landscape. But they come to Canada because there's so much to see. They sometimes go over waterfalls in canoes because they don't know there's a waterfall in the river. But that's part of the fun, I suppose, of visiting Canada. Yeah.
In terms of fluidity, do you feel like Hiro, when you were in Germany, what were the conversations around your work?
The theme of the conference that year, as I remember, was borders, migration, and there was a third: borders, migration, and
Diaspora?
what was it?
Diaspora, maybe?
I don't think it was that. No, it was, but it all had to do with it did have to do with mobility, and it's a question I grapple with myself. Am I a hyphenated identity? Am I Japanese Canadian? A hyphenated identity? And when I was in Germany, the thing is that when I was in Germany, I never felt like people saw me as a hyphenated Canadian, as like Japanese Canadian. They just seemed to. It was never brought up. It just seemed to be that I was a representative of Canada, and I actually, because John Horgan, the former Premier of BC, who was at the time he had been appointed ambassador to Germany, he was at the conference also, and we were the two English speakers, so we got seated at the same table for dinners and so on. So it was interesting also. I'd met him before, but it was interesting also to spend time with him and just feel like we were the Canadians, But yeah, because as a Japanese Canadian, I think for those of us who are not white, there remains in Canada this question of is there like a Canada, and then is there like a separate Canada for hyphenated Canadians whose identity is more ambiguous or bifurcated in some way, but East Asians, the Japanese especially, I think because of our socioeconomic status and our historical experience, we are verging on what you might call honorary white status. Is that funny?
I think you quoted it. So
I quoted it, okay.
Yeah.
No, a lot of my plays, I think, are about, to some extent, the relationship between the culture of whiteness, the dominant culture of whiteness, and those on its periphery. I recall, I was just telling you earlier about a performance art piece I did with Milton Lim, who is an artist from, he's Canadian, but from Hong Kong originally, and he has a company called Hong Kong Exile. We did a performance piece where we had a list of items, and we would go up to people on the street and ask them, is this white or not white, and there were things on the list like Barack Obama, is he white or not white? Chow mein or spaghetti, white or not white? And and we went up to a food truck driver, a donair food truck, and there was a Middle Eastern man in the truck. And one of the last questions we asked was, is Milton white or not white? And the man in the donair truck was insistent that Milton was white. He immediately said, "Oh, he's white." And when I pointed out that, well, he's Asian, he's from Hong Kong, and the donair man said, "Canadian white." So, but to me that does underline the fact that 80 years on from the events of forgiveness, when the Japanese were, during World War II and in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Japanese were one of the most despised ethnic groups in North America. But today, the Japanese and other East Asians are completely accepted, it seems to me, in Canadian society. Notwithstanding, there was anti-Asian hate during COVID.
Yeah.
But when you think of, when I think of my Asian friends, especially the women, the vast majority of them are married to white men. I myself am married to someone who is, she's indigenous, but, white presenting really. So there's been a level of assimilation among East Asians that is perhaps going to be available to everyone, but perhaps not. When I think of my wife who identifies as indigenous, I do wonder whether the indigenous community and white Canada will always be two solitudes. And to some extent, I do feel that the indigenous community doesn't necessarily want to be honorary white ever, So going abroad, that's an interesting question for me, because I have an identity on my face that is separate from what my passport represents.
Right. Peter?
We were talking earlier, and I was talking about this story that my partner and I spent some time in Vietnam. And every time I go, especially the further you go away from Canada, I assume everyone thinks I'm American when I travel, right? And I imagine that's probably the case for a lot of you. And we were in this beautiful town called Hoi An, and we're some small family museum. We went and visited, and the family was giving the tours, and they're showing us around, and we're having this lovely conversation. And then the question of our nationality came up. And they said, without a problem, we're not wearing Canadian flags on our knapsacks or anything. You're Canadian. And I think we all have the experience of just assuming when we're somewhere else that people think we're American. And I said, yeah, how did you know? Well, you smile. You ask questions, you listen, right? And I think, and there's just a gentleness to you, right? And I think that those are things about the way the world sees us in a lot of ways. And obviously, like, who's been to a Mexican in a resort in Mexico at some time? And not all Canadians are angels on the international stage. You'll probably are spending some time in Mexico. But there's just something about, and in Vietnam is far away from here. So I would assume if they knew I wasn't American, maybe they thought I was Australian. Or when I'm in Europe, I'm often get mistaken for being Dutch or German or something like that, right? But no, they knew I was Canadian. And I still don't know why that was. But there's clearly something, and I don't think I'm an emblematic Canadian. I'm kind of a failed Canadian in many ways. I never played hockey.
Whoa.
I'm a white guy who never played hockey. I played basketball. But I think there's something about that's something that they recognized, right? And I imagine this has happened to other people in this room as well.
That's great. Anne?
Well, I should kind of change the topic, although it's all on the same topic because it's a big topic. There have been attempts to establish a Canadian National Theatre, one attempt in particular I think in 1969, building a space in Ottawa, which is still precarious financially. But it's attempted to more recently, to include as many different cultures or peoples or identities in Canada as possible. It's got a French aspect, and an English one, and an Indigenous theater as well. Because it was considered, I mean, sometimes by people in Alberta, maybe more than sometimes, that, well, what is national about it? You know, it doesn't include us. Our playwrights are not going there. But I think there was an attempt to take it across the country. A few years ago, it was called the Magnetic North Theatre Festival, and productions were moved from every other year from Ottawa. Then the other years would be going to other companies, other theaters across Canada. It was a very expensive project, as you can imagine. I think it was a great idea while it lasted. But recently, it's hired a new artistic director, who is now I have to
Filipino, Nina Leaquino?
Yeah, Nina Leaquino, who's had a lot of experience, mostly in Toronto, with various different cultural theaters that were formed to address and express and represent the voices of their community. So the mandate now of the National Theatre is equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. And it includes co-productions with companies in Toronto such as Crows, Soul Pepper, and Tarragon. But Nina Leaquino has been artistic director of many companies in Ontario, Fujian Asian Canadian Theatre, Cahoots, Obsidian, Native Earth Performing. I mean, she's been involved with interculturalism for her career, basically, and now she's bringing it to the National Theatre, which I think is a really good idea. So I think, there are attempts to include, I don't even like that word, but making it possible for many peoples, many cultures, many languages to contribute to a country. And I think, as Peter mentioned, it's always fluid. It's always changing, and those changes can be addressed as well as what's perceived to be the way it was.
Yeah, it's for those of you who know, that Salesman in China, which was on our stage last year, Nina came and saw it, and then we had a long conversation around what that is. And it ended up on the stage this year, so I went down and got to see it. It's a different stage and it's a different experience, but it's still the same show. And we have another show that is in 2026, which will be announced in a week or two, which will also end up at the National Arts Center. When Stratford looks at partnerships, our best partner is the National Arts Center. You can drive the truck up. You open the doors, it goes into that theater. It fits really well as long as there's conversation around some of the parameters of that. But for the most part, they're a great partner for us. The National Arts Center is an interesting thing. Then the Indigenous Theatre, I think is 2017, had only just started. So there was a long conversation. A Debajama jig up at Manitoulin Island. They sat down and looked at all the Indigenous theatre to see if there was enough in the canon to support an Indigenous theatre, and then they realized how much there was, and so that happened. And Nina is fantastic in terms of being the new artistic director, taking over for Jillian Kiley, and her work is like, it's uniquely Canadian. It is across the country. She's really trying to spread that, go coast to coast to coast to try to bring more stories that are really exciting and interesting to the stage. I don't know if all of you know about, and this will get to my question, is this idea of, the Massey Levesque Commission, that actually all our major regional theaters, like the National Arts Center, you've got the Citadel in Edmonton, you've got Neptune and all that, basically post-war in World War II, They went across the country and interviewing because it was about Canadian culture and about how do we support that. And so lots of government dollars went into building all these regional theaters that you see across the country to support this idea of what is the arts and what is a Canadian voice. This is what we're engaging with, what international people are engaging with. I was just recently, 4 years ago, I was in an international Indigenous gathering, and we all sat down and we were all talking about our work, and it was very easy. Like the Maori in Aotearoa, which is New Zealand, we were talking because we are colonies, former colonies, whatever we see ourselves as now. We all have the same funding model. So in New Zealand, their model is based upon our model, and our new model, which just was revamped after 50 years, about 7 years ago, is based on the British model right now. And they had done a revamp, and Australia is based on that too. And so all 4 of those funding models are all connected. They all talk to each other, and they kind of built models. Dependent on each country is a little bit different, but we all had a language. All the Indigenous artists had a language. All of those governments were reconciling with their relationship with Indigenous people, and then all the work of other artists and IBPOC work. So we had this conversation internationally. It felt like we were talking to people like from Vancouver to Toronto, and we were talking like Sydney, Australia, Wellington, New Zealand, and Toronto, Canada. We all had the same conversation. And then we were sitting and talking, and we were in New York City. We were in a YMCA in the basement, and one of the woman who wrote the Thanksgiving play in the United States, she basically put her hand up and said, "We have nothing here. The United States, we don't even, on Broadway, Indigenous people don't even have its own theater. We have zero funding publicly. All the things you're all talking about, we have nothing. We have nothing, any kind of support." And then suddenly realized, oh, right, within this British colony, within these structures, we have built this idea of, well, how do we support new voices in that? And so there was this acknowledgement about, wow, we are actually really lucky that we can have these conversations together and find international partnerships. So the Canada Council for the Arts has a bunch of partnerships internationally with both Australia and New Zealand because it's easy. So I'm wondering, because Peter had talked earlier when we were on our Zoom around the idea that we had this model, this kind of state-driven model for up to the 70s, and then things shifted. And I'm just wondering with all of you, how have those things shifted within our culture, within the art making, and how does that change? And then how is it seen outside of us? Big question. Boom. I won't answer it. I will leave it to you.
Okay, they're looking at me to do it, so I will try. I'll speak about my world, academia, but there are, one of the most interesting things about art production in the last 50 years is that the lines between academia and art production are almost non-existent now, right? And there's a lot of infusion. I think, and I'm a historian of Canadian cultural nationalism. So one of the things you have from the when it was Massey Commission, 1950?
Yeah, I think it's 48 to 50.
Yeah. To, say, 1980 or so, there was a project of creating a national culture, right? And from the 60s onwards, that starts to fall apart for a variety of things. You have the rise of Quebec nationalism. You have the rise of Indigenous resurgent movements. You have civil rights movements. You have feminist movement, the GLBTQ plus movement. In 1964, I think, 63, 64, Canada dropped its race-based immigration policy. And so you have rapidly changing demographics in Canada. So the idea of and then you also have emergence of various regionalisms, which have always been the case across Canada. So by 1980, that project of a national culture kind of falls apart, right? And then you have the rise of multi-channel universe and social media and so on that were just further fragmented these things. And so one of the changing dynamics is that this has been incredibly productive, culturally productive in a lot of ways, because you have we saw Art War last night. We saw Forgiveness the day before. If you have a chance to see them or you haven't seen them, please do. They're both wonderful pieces. So And in both of these plays, they're dealing with issues of trauma, memory, loss, and so on, both around the World War II, which was a global war. So this is something in some ways an international experience, right? But with that, and you have very specifically Canadian kind of ways of the way we figured out of living together. So like one of the, I don't want to ruin the play for you, but I will maybe. Forgiveness. So in Forgiveness, there's this kind of, one of the narratives that runs through it is a kind of a potential Romeo and Juliet story, right? So son from a Japanese family, daughter from a settler family, right? And it kind of culminates in this dinner that they were coming to. And so the Japanese family was hosting the dinner. And so the settler parents come, and the Japanese family asked them to take off their shoes, right? And they were just perplexed. What do they want me to take off their shoes? What's going on here,
No,
right?
it was the guy who was perplexed, not the wife.
And the woman was like, but I got my fancy shoes on, right? So it was this moment of decision, right? So they could have said, I'm not taking my shoes, or I'm not. If I can't wear my shoes, I'm not coming in. So they do the. But you see this moment in which they decided that they were going to recognize and respect this other way of living, and so they then take off their shoes and step into this other world, which is shared world, but there's some difference in it, and then it wasn't a solemn experience, because then the father, the settler father, makes a joke about it. So like that sort of humor that sort of also worked to sort of take away the kind of the feeling of anxiety around the event. And one of the things that people in my world, cultural studies, Canada's world, talk about the importance of humor in Canadian society. That we have this sort of dry, often ironic humor, which allows us to put distance and also to talk about hard things. So both of these plays were talking about hard things, difficult past, but there were these also very funny moments, which were incredibly important, I think, for the audience and for everyone, right? So that's my start for that answer.
Well, I'll have a little intercultural anecdote too. We were hosting a couple from the Netherlands, and we had a choir exchange. So we were staying with them 2 weeks, and they stayed with us. And I thought, well, I have to give them Canadian food, so I offered them corn on the cob. And the woman looked at this and said, "I can't eat this." I said, "Well, what's wrong?" "No, that's what we feed the pigs."
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that from my Dutch family.
Well, it's a revelation to me that all the cornfields around here are not for human consumption, right? It's mostly dent corn, what we call dent corn. Do you call that? It's got a dent in it.
Yeah.
Oh.
And it's feed corn,
Feed corn,
basically. Yeah. I'm supported by the infrastructure.
Were you always supported? Like, do you feel like in your career, like you feel like there has been a significant base, or do you feel like it's shifted?
As an actor, I have not always been supported.
Right.
I don't feel as an actor I have. My first professional play was a co-production between Factory and the National Arts Center. So I feel that as a writer, I have always been supported. But having said that, there are two, and I'm now an elder statesman in my community because I'm pretty old.
36 never looks so
No,
good.
no, I'm the age of vampires, Keith, the age of vampires. But, thinking back to the writers, the people that I admired from my community when I was young. So Joy Kogawa, there's an interview with her from a defunct magazine called Saturday Night, I believe it was called, in Toronto. And in that interview, this great quote of hers where she said, "Lord, I'm so tired of being a professional ethnic." And so that's something that I've tried to avoid and have struggled against in my career. I don't want to be a professional ethnic. I want to talk about other things besides my ethnic identity. And the other experience I had was with Philip Kangotanda, who is a Japanese-American playwright. He's one of the grandfathers of Asian American theater, started writing plays in the 60s. And I had the opportunity to be in a play of his about 20 years ago at American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. They had commissioned a play from him for their 40th anniversary. And one day I was having brunch at his house, and he revealed to me that it was the first main stage production of his career. And he said something very similar to what Joy Kogawa had said. And he said to me, God, I'm so sick of being studioed to death. So I think that's still a reality for
Can you explain what that
is?
is? I think we know what that means to be studioed, but what to...
Well, I think what it is that writers who are perceived to be from a marginalized community, that the theater ecology wants to support them, but not to the extent of putting their plays on the main stages, right? So their plays are relegated to the studio stages and the black boxes.
Or the late openers.
Yeah.
Some of them.
Well, there was a period in Stratford history, Stratford Festival history, where the Canadian plays were only in the studio, because they were considered high risk financially, I guess.
Absolutely.
And so it was so great to come and see a Canadian play in the Patterson Theatre with all the bells and whistles, and it just the things have.
Well, and that's a testament to
improved
Anthony,
in that
right?
respect. Yeah, I guess we were also talking about the casting of different plays as well. Do you need the appropriate ethnic casting with the actors looking the part, or what's happening now is this is open for it's a very open kind of thing where you can cast Iago with a woman or a woman actor, or Juliet as a brunette, and we were talking about this just before the forum. I'm still a little conflicted about this, but that's also the way it's going. It's kind of it's not cross-cultural. It's like anybody can play any role because they're voicing their own story through the role, or their own culture through the role, or their own social situation. And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that in the panel.
Yeah, I think the more opportunity, traditionally, there's lots of roles that women don't get to play, and oftentimes some of the greats that have been on our stage have looked and said, the men get an hour and 30 minutes of time, and I've got 15 minutes. I would just love to play that part. I think for them, it's just there's a dynamic. Lots of the stuff that happens in a Shakespeare play to the women happens off stage, actually. And so that idea of giving opportunity for someone with Shauna McKenna's talent, say, hey, why don't you try, one of these big roles, like the Scottish play or something? It could be very interesting. And so to me, it's I'm always excited with new ways to hear. I had said to all of you, as the director of new play development, I receive 200 adaptations of plays based on Shakespeare every year at least. This is Desdemona, the play. This is Desdemona after this, whatever. Even Aaron Shields wrote a play that was just at Soul Pepper, was called Queen Goneril, because she really believed that everyone watches King Lear, they hate the women, and they don't understand why those women are the way they are when we arrive at them. And so she's like, I want a prequel that kind of talks about their struggle to the point where they're frustrated that their father's giving away the land. They're not just evil women. They have a long history with their father that's been very frustrating that leads up to King Lear. And so that idea, so we receive those all the time, and they are actually writing plays to fulfill those because those Shakespeares don't actually have those opportunities. So I always find that really exciting. Just to go off of what you were saying about the thing that I find really exciting right now is like, so Art of War was written by Yvette Nolan, who's an Algonquin Indigenous playwright, but it has nothing to do with her culture. And I did that on purpose. Like I gave it to Antony and said, we should do this. She wants to talk about World War II and about painters, about people who painted, were embedded artists during, wartime. And on several occasions, I've had people come up to me, hey, can I ask a question? I'm like, sure. And they were like, what makes this play Indigenous? And I was like, well, it's written by an Indigenous playwright. So it's Indigenous just by its nature. It comes with an Indigenous worldview. So you'll see that. And to me, it's like the great thing about the world and about the future of so many great playwrights like Hiro is the idea is like, you can speak about something that's very personal, and oftentimes their first couple plays are like that. And then I love that next one that says, so now what do you want to talk about? Because we're all engaging in the world in different ways. And I just love when a playwright doesn't have to go through the lens of their culture and someone go, oh, like an Indigenous play, does it have residential school or the scoop system or this or that? Like, if it doesn't have those things, people go like, I don't recognize the story because it doesn't have the things that I've learned are in those stories. It's like, yeah, but we just actually just want to have a funny. Like, that's the thing about Drew Hayden Taylor. Oftentimes his plays are just really funny. He wants an audience to have a really good night out. He happens to also talk about some other things. So to me, it's an exciting time internationally, because I'm seeing that also with international artists, is that the work they're talking about and the stuff they're putting on stage actually isn't about their identity, isn't about their culture. It's actually about things they're engaged with and things they want to talk about, like global warming. Like that's a huge one right now with a lot of the artists that I'm seeing. They just want to talk about the things they're scared about right now. So yeah, any thoughts?
Well, perhaps that's an indication that race and ethnicity as an organizing principle of society is becoming less important, and like it's hard for us to imagine that because that's been our whole lives. But there have been periods in history when race and ethnicity were not the organizing principle around which society, like even in Europe, it was more important. Your religion was more important at one time than your race and ethnicity. So, having, lived under this system for several hundred years where race and ethnicity is kind of the principal, organizing principle of the way we divide ourselves up, it's hard to imagine a world where that is not the case, but maybe what you're speaking of is an indication that things are shifting, and that's probably a net good for a country like Canada.
I can speak of my own local academic part of the world.
Sure.
Director of a big humanities PhD program, and the humanities are not very happy right now. They're not doing well, lots of students and generally. And I've been talking to a lot of colleagues about it, and at some point in time, there was this shift in humanities scholarship towards the exploration of various differences, right? So the gender differences, racial differences, and so on. And we stopped talking about humanity and humans and talked about very specific subset of humans. And what's the shift is that now that we are in this moment in which humanity as a whole, our existence is in question with global warming, but also sort of the return of 19th century empire politics and all these, stuff we haven't said it, but, stuff happening the south of the border. There is this return to actually, let's think about humanity as a whole, but not in the way that we did in like 1950 when humanity were a bunch white European men were the representative of all humanity, but it's this sort of much more sort of multi-perspectival understanding of humanity, which understands we all live different realities. We all bring different histories to the fore, but we still share some space. And I think some of the things that Hiro was talking about was that. It's just that and in your work is this attempt to tell these two stories and the intersection of these stories, right? And I think that there's a shift back towards that kind of work because we have this problem of how we're going to survive as a species almost over the next 150, 200 years. Right?
Well, that's to me, what's exciting about the Canadian experience, because as we've alluded, it feels like Canada is a nation that still wants to have those conversations, whether we get to any destination or not. We want to explore and have those conversations, whereas a country like Japan, like Toyoshi Yoshihara, the gentleman you mentioned earlier, who has his company New Maple Theatre in Canada, he actually translated my first play, Tiger of Malaya, but said, well, it will never be produced in Japan because it touches upon Japanese atrocities during World War II, and so it can never be produced in Japan. Yeah. And last week there were actually some Japanese theater producers who came to see Forgiveness, and our director, Stratford and I went to talk to them after the show, and Stafford's first question to them was, given the politics of forgiveness, can this be produced in Japan? So,
What'd they say?
They said it could, I have my
That's a lukewarm,
doubts.
Wow.
I have my doubts, but
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'm happy to report that, and maybe I'm overly optimistic here, but there is a play recently that's traveling across the country and to other parts, including the U.S., called Come From Away, which is a very welcoming, very positive play. I'm sure you've all heard about it. When the 9/11 tragedy happened, and Americans caught in the midst of this were landing in Gander, Newfoundland, and welcomed by the community, and it's a wonderful, heartwarming play to see, and so it gives you hope. It gives you, just more confidence in the way we're perceived, but also perhaps the way we would perceive ourselves as this warm, welcoming country, which is not as wholly true, but it's always nice to see that representation of ourselves, because when we compare ourselves to the U.S., it's always, the advantage of ourselves against the U.S. So it's nice to celebrate the country and its potential and its and just not welcome everybody.
And said this thing the other day, which I hold on to and I hope, is that you said our disunity is our unity, and that idea of that's the one thing lots of people say, is that we live side by side, and oftentimes in other countries those things ignite into violence into that. And for the most part, we tend to be able to live side by side with different cultures, different experiences in life, and that's part of that. So hopefully that continues. That's our responsibility. We have a half hour left, and I've got a few questions. So I ask us to answer briefly as best we can, see how many of these we can get through. Sound good? Okay. Sorry, I didn't bring my glasses. Lots of talk about how we're perceived internationally. What about how we perceive each other? We're talking regionally, like BC, the Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes. What do we recognize we have in common?
Small question.
Well, we're recognized as being nice, I guess. Yeah, I would think, there's positive and negatives to this, of course. There's a critical thing about, saying how we don't understand our history and and all these terrible atrocities in the past. Oh my goodness, we didn't realize that happened, and how can that be? And singing the wringing of the hands. I think there should be more focus on what we do have. When you travel, you realize that we have a hell of a lot here that most people in this world don't have. So that's the way I'd like to see it. I guess I don't know whether that's an accurate interpretation.
Hiro?
Well, I think we have so much in common, but it's just too bad that geographically we're so separated. Because when we do have opportunities like Magnetic North, or like a play from BC gets to come here, or we get plays from Ontario and so on. There's nothing culturally preventing us from enjoying one another's work. But having said that, I think Canada is Ontario-centric. Culturally, it's culturally it's Ontario-centric.
Speaking as an Albertan,
And,
yes.
and I think in BC we certainly suffer from that to some extent. But really, it's even though it's this thin, 4,000 kilometer ribbon along the U.S. border, something like 95% of us live within 45 minutes of that border. Despite that, it's a very cohesive culture, I think, and again, that's something that I personally feel like I want to spend more time exploring and celebrating.
I agree. I think, we have, a whole tradition of provincial politicians wanting to emphasize differences from the rest of Canada for their own purposes, and but especially when you travel, and if you're in an unfamiliar environment, you see another Canadian. It's just, even though they might be from Newfoundland or from northern BC, places I've never been, you're just so delighted to see them. And especially, sometimes I end up myself in an American conference where there's me and the other Canadian, and we stick together like glue. And I think so. There is a common, not necessarily culture, but I think there's common values about how to react to interact with people, what kind of world we want to live in, what kind of world, how we want to live together. And I think those things shine out more than, because, you go to, I was joking, this is my how I'm a failure as Canadian. I work in Ottawa, my partner lives in Montreal. I'd never been west of Toronto before this weekend. I've never been to Southern Ontario, west of Toronto. I've been to Niagara, but it's always hugged the kind of, St. Lawrence. And it's a qualitatively different culture from even Eastern Ontario here, right? So we have these, because it's such a massive country, and it's populated in different ways, we have all these kinds of regional differences. Yet the values are the same. Often between, there's obviously the sort of difference between, some values are more important in Alberta than they are in Ontario, but they're still the same values. It's what kind of prominence you give to various values.
What I would say is meeting a farmer in Stratford is the same as the farmer I met in Saskatchewan. In terms of their belief system, their passions, it's a very, also the debate between who is ruder, someone from Toronto or someone from Vancouver, is an active debate. And then also, talking about what's your favorite city in Canada, and always it comes down to Halifax and Montreal for the culture, for the unique cultures. And it's Halifax is just you land in this Acadian culture and the music and that. You go to Quebec, everyone's you land in this French culture with the music and that. It's so to me, it's interesting how much we are different and yet we're also the same. And I've had the good fortune of having my play produced in different provinces. And in every one of those provinces, everyone says, that's my uncle. I wrote it for Northern Ontario, it's Northern Ontario blue-collar guys. I even had a Maori artist say, change it from a fox to a dingo, and that's my uncle. So it's there we go. So to me, it's there's something quite beautiful in how we find each other. So next question. I think we have to go a little faster. Speaking of French, how does French Canada fit into this conversation? Quebec maintains a thriving cultural ecosystem, but that is barely has an impact outside of the province.
Translation problems. I think there are some wonderful translators in the country and have done some good work, but not enough. So we're still, it was supposed to be a bilingual country where the reality is that, in Alberta we do have French theaters, but there are, they're mostly catering to a small French population in the city and in the province. So I don't know quite. Yeah, it's intriguing because Tremblay, for example, was very popular in Scotland, and the Les Berceaux was translated into Scots. And it is done in English Canada because it's translated into English, but unfortunately, I don't think there's enough of that happening. We're still, in a way, to quote the old cliche, that two solitudes. Yeah.
I feel like so many of us cultural workers in English Canada are envious of Quebec, of Quebecois artists, because they do have a distinct identity. And they also, the culture seems like Quebec seems to support their own in a way that English Canada doesn't.
Okay, so I live in a border town, right? So, and so French is always close to me. I live half in Ottawa, half Montreal, so French is always close to me. But I think one of the things that strikes me is that English Canadians, but also Australians, the Anglosphere is the most militantly monolingual group in the world. My mother was Dutch, and she had to graduate high school, she had to be fluent in 4 languages. Whereas, and so I think that part of it is, one can live in Toronto and never speak a word of French and be fine. Right? I live in a part of Canada that you have to speak both languages. Well, you don't have to in Ottawa, but it helps a lot. And I think, but we were in Acadia for a vacation, and we were surprised that French language is booming there, and it is actually being a really heroic project of bringing the French language back into everyday life, and we were blown away by it. So.
That's great. So Liana Brody, who was one of the writers for Salesman in China, works in Quebec. She's a translator. Her and I have in deep conversation with a number of Francophone playwrights that she's really excited about. I'm going to go to Montreal this year to see one of the shows she's talked about. We did do I Am William, which was a translation of a Francophone. We did Les Berceaux, which is great, but also kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of the most popular Francophone playwright of all time. My wife is a Francophone, so she is holding my feet to the fire about that. She's from Quebec. So, and last year for the Playwrights Retreat, we brought for the first time a Francophone playwright from Quebec in. The only problem was, for me, is I'm not fluent in French, and in terms of helping them with their work, whereas the English, it was so easy. I just thought, we'll bring a Francophone. It'd be great to hear another perspective and to be able to talk about that, but then I actually couldn't help her with her work. So then I had my wife reading it and talking to me about what was happening, and so we tried, and we had long conversations about the work, but not actually the kind of bread and butter of it. So it's an ongoing thing. I think it's ongoing conversation, but whoever wrote that, I absolutely agree in terms of that. When we did the Art of War, at the beginning of Art of War, not to tout the show here, but there's all the songs are land-based, and they're all by Canadians, and there's 3 Francophones in French in the songs, because I said we need to hear French if we're going to talk about Canada and have... because the land acknowledgement is embedded into the music, which is hilarious because when they start hearing the names of the indigenous peoples, everyone goes quiet. It's not meant to happen, but it goes quiet, and then the music continues, and then no one knows what they all think. Well, this is when the show starts, right? Which is what we're all been trained to do, but it's not the case. The music keeps playing. So, and one of the Francophone playwrights sings a song about Saskatchewan. So that's his chorus. The whole chorus is Saskatchewan. So, all right, next question. Does the play come from a way elevate international understanding of Canadians or perpetuate stereotypes of Canadians and Newfoundlanders? Anybody?
I've never seen it, so
Well, I mean, if
I
you,
know,
yeah,
I'm
well,
Phil Canadian.
yeah. I mean, if you
Doesn't play hockey, hasn't seen Come From Away.
yeah. No. If you've been to Newfoundland and you've you've talked to Newfoundlanders, it's not a stereotype. It's a warm representation, and it's based on what happened. I mean, it can't, because it's positive, and we're seeing ourselves as warm and welcoming people. Doesn't mean to say it's a stereotype. I mean, I think there's that aspect there as well, and it's certainly evident in Newfoundland. Again, it's a place where you start talking to a guy who's cutting his grass so you can see the iceberg, and he's got 2 sons who work in Alberta, and I know who they are. So I mean, we have to resist categorizing things as stereotypes if they're, when they're positive. I think we can believe stuff about ourselves.
Any?
No, I think that's what, I mean, just because something is almost universally true or, is so dead on, I don't necessarily think that makes it a stereotype.
Yeah. It's interesting. We had a play that we were developing, and it was a Newfoundland playwright, and every character in the play is Newfoundland. And when you read it, it's written in the language and in the accent. And one of the notes I got from a senior person was, are we going to be laughing with these characters, or are we going to be laughing at them? And that sometimes with like an accent or something we can, and that when, especially with Newfoundlanders, I mean, they're so charming, beautiful. They say things that are really quite quippy. And in that show, it's really quite like that. But I feel like it's an honest representation of a real story. And it just happens that they're Newfoundlanders. And so I think Americans, maybe some Americans would think that we all talk like that. Maybe, or someone else. But to me, it's like once they know and understand where it comes from and what that territory, I think it's more of a learning. I think it's more of a eye-opening thing. So, great. All right, next question. Today is focusing on drama and literature. Let's not forget music, dance, other disciplines. So should these other disciplines be less emphasized? Yes. No, not at all. Sorry. Just joking.
Well, it's where we are and what we're engaged in now, and this seemed an appropriate topic for this situation. Maybe we can have a forum on these other important aspects of Canadian culture another time. Yeah.
Geez, I feel like Canadian musicians, composers, dancers, visual artists that they're doing great. They may be doing better than theater artists. Really, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, CanLit obviously is huge internationally, but when I think of Canadian musicians and composers and dancers, they're also doing phenomenal work internationally.
Yeah. Oh, especially still, being around Montreal, so like you have Cirque du Soleil, La La Lume, Steps, all these huge dance troupes and theater troupes,
Right, yeah.
and Canadian like popular and jazz music and composers, globally known, right? Like in some sense, we overproduce musicians in Canada, and so I think and visual artists are doing incredibly well as well. So.
What I would say is the recognition that the Fleck just closed in Toronto. It was a huge dance hub in the Toronto scene in terms of modern dance, not just the ballet and stuff like that. I do think that we're all victims of staying home and watching our screens and our TVs more than we're going out. I think that's a post-COVID thing as well. Speaking with musicians right now, it's really tough go with these subscription-based things. No one's being paid enough. They can't make a living in terms of that. Films are that way as we move into AI and stuff like that. So I do think there is something. I think it's a tough go, and going to live events, lots of musicians are doing live events and smaller events that's away from Ticketmaster. There's all this, just in terms of the art being made right now, but like today, you all showing up here, like people showing up and being present, like in person, like the festival right now, lots of the theaters are full and people are showing up, and we're really grateful for that. But I would think across the board, it's a struggle to get people out of their homes like never before. I think we're just getting used to, like, I can do it at home, I can watch it at home, or I can do something else. And in that, all those disciplines, some of the lesser ones like dance, it's a very specific thing. Sometimes it's like 4 or 5 days of the show and then it's gone. That's I was like, you guys do all that work and it's a 4-day run or 3-day run. Like, it's hard sometimes to hit those things. So I think it's deeply important, but it's how we get bums in seats and try to, and as someone like the festival that has the resources, I think we also have to support that through these kinds of forum events and side events that happen, support other disciplines. So yeah, boom. Okay, oh, sorry, this was a question I didn't get to. As grateful visitors from the south of the border, we gather that the signs declaring that Canadians stand together are a response to the megalomaniac from Washington.
Yes.
But are there other factors as well that make the call for unity timely? I would say yes. I'll start because I always end. I would say yes because Alberta's trying to separate right now. We've had at times...
No, not Alberta. No. The Premier of
The Premier of Alberta is trying to separate.
Yeah.
Fair, yeah. And we've had this discussion with Quebec on several occasions of separating such a large country. And I think that support of being Canadian, that continues to come up in different ways. That's not just about our identity from south of the border, but that's me. Anybody else?
Well, I think the consensus that it's not a bad thing in a way that we are now thinking about ourselves as viable and worth making an effort for, and recognizing ourselves and who we are and what we do, and that's why we're here now. I think it's just more interest in that, whereas it was Canadian boring. There's no such person, but. So it's not maybe it looks negative to an American, but it's positive to Canadians, and it's not necessarily just political. It's also cultural and emotional.
Yeah, I've been struck by the fact that Canadians seem to be. And because we weren't a very nationalistic country for the last 20 years or so. That's been rather muted. We've been talking about being global, open to the world, and so on. And how quickly Canadians, when they felt threatened, and this weird experiment that we're doing felt under threat, how they just, the elbows up, that resonated with all sorts of people almost immediately. And it's we live in Quebec, and suddenly Quebecois are flying Canadian flags, which and so there is this kind of, which is deeply surprising, and so there's just this moment in which the fear of losing something that's incredibly important to us has brought us together, and sometimes it just takes a moment like this for that to happen.
Great. We have 7 minutes. Just what is the single biggest challenge that Canadian theaters face today? Related to this challenge, do you have advice for an aspiring playwright, actor, and other theater workers?
Hang in there.
It's well, it feels perilous. It's always felt perilous, but yes, especially during COVID and post-COVID, it does feel like a lot of our theater institutions could fail for all the reasons you just mentioned. And it is very hard, I think, for young actors and playwrights to get a foot in the door and make any kind of a viable living. And my situation also is not is kind of precarious, really, most of the time. So really, I don't have any advice except there's no advice except if you want to do it, you just have to do it. And right, there's no magic bullet or program. There's no some secret knowledge that if you had, you would be okay. There just isn't. It's precarious always.
Yeah. Again, I'm not a theater person, but I students who want to do a PhD, that's exactly the advice I give them.
Yeah.
It might work out. It might not. I'm making any guarantees.
If you
but you'll
really
learn
want
something
to.
along the way. And I think this is, some people are lucky and some are talented and some are both, right?
Yeah. Well, I would also just say that there's something about the understanding of arts and culture and its impact on the Canadian society. This idea, you'll hear the $10 for every dollar spent in Canadian culture and arts, $10 goes back to the community. And they actually did when they just recently did it, it's actually more. It's almost double. Like the Stratford Festival brings almost $500 million to this community. It's like $437 million goes through. And that's from restaurants to like paving roads to this and that. This idea of like, we're going to subsidize oil and because it's big big jobs, and I get and understand that. But the idea if you actually invested in arts and culture on a level and people came up and people came and partake in it, and people who have the money and the resources and the time that if they actually spent it on that, like that, it will pay back that community. These restaurants, like we were going to change the time this year, like maybe 7:30, maybe 7 o'clock starts and this, and the BIA here, all the local businesses like, whoa, we can get 2 settings. Like we can get someone at 6 and we can get someone at 7. That's good for business. And we were like, yes, because we're community partners, right? Saying, so this idea of like, how do we support them and how do they support us? That can happen everywhere. And that's, basically why the Massey Levesque Commission built regional theaters across Canada. You go to Thousand Islands in Kingston. It's like those communities come together. The Citadel in Edmonton, the Neptune Theatre right downtown Halifax, Theatre Calgary, you get Vertigo. All those theaters gather people. They go to restaurants. It's a nice, fun night out. And that supports the thing. So that, to me, I think is the biggest hurdle is to get people, like I'm speaking to the choir right now, but there are those people outside who's like, I've never been to a play. And you're like, oh man, it would just be great to get you hooked, So, okay, next question. More than any other country, I think Canadians Yes, for sure. More than any other country, I think Canadians are believing all cultures, races, and genders as equal and none superior. Is this true today, and does Canadian theatre support this? Anybody?
I think we're trying. I think anti-racism is not universally distributed across Canada, right? But I think there's at least fumbling attempt to try to reduce racism, anti-GLBTQ hate and stuff.
Well, when you think about, a past where any Canadian play at Stratford was in the studio theater, and compared to today and the diversity of the cast and the stories being told, we are making, we're not perfect and there's a long way to go, but I think that we are making tremendous progress. And I've certainly seen that over my lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's the importance of theater too, is that we can see and through the characters and the themes and issues that we can talk to each other. We can connect that way, and so that's what makes theater so important. Therefore, we have to drag all our relatives and friends kicking and screaming to the theater to see something. I've had that experience too, where people are thinking, "Well, no, I don't go to plays," and they're just, "Wow, that was so great. I'll go and see some more."
And one more plug for theater is that theater, as opposed to even going to a movie when you're in the dark and you just all leave, is a collective experience. So when you watch these characters struggling with these issues, you're struggling with them too. And when you walk out, you talk about these things, and it sort of generates interesting conversations.
Yeah, I would just say that it's about being humble in those moments, because I, as a former artistic director, every time I went, we've got it, it's perfect. And then it would definitely go south very quickly. And so that idea of like recognizing that we've made some headway and recognize that it's always fluid and moving, that it's never a set point. The idea is that we still have lots of work to do, and it's something you don't just come, because I think a lot of people want rules and expectations set. And the idea is it's always a moving target. These things are moving always in what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong in terms of access and all those things. And I think it's just you have to continue to be active in those responses. So yeah. I think we are at 12 noon. James is itching over here to come in and finish us off for the day. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions. Apologies.
But thank you for all your questions, and thank you to our panel for the fascinating discussion today. I think that was fantastic. Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with the lively conversations and original performances on the Stratford Festival streaming service, Stratfest at Home. And for making it this far in the episode, enjoy 1 month for free. Visit stratfestathome.ca and enter code FREEMONTH. It takes you, our listeners, to make this possible. It also takes the support of our dear collaborators. Support for the Meighen Forum is generously provided by Kelly and Michael Meighen and the T.R. Meighen Family Foundation. Original score for the Everyday Forum podcast was provided by Hilary Adams. Production support is provided by the film production and distribution team at the Stratford Festival. That is coordinator Vilma Mancini and director Jenna McGaw. The Meighen Forum team is producing assistant Renata Hansen, associate coordinator James Hyatt, manager Gregory McLaughlin, and director Julie Miles. Special thanks to Mike Duncan, Greg Doherty, and Harper Charlton. Finally, thanks to artistic director Anthony Cimolino and executive director Anita Gaffney. From here in Stratford, Ontario, on the land of the Neutrals and the Anishinaabe, see you next time. Ba Ma Pi.